Welcome to the past unveiled, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. We will now begin. Story 1. The Quiet Invasion Norsemen on the East Coast. You're standing on a shingle beach in Northumbria, somewhere near Lindisfarne in the early 790s. The wind is sharp, the sky a dull gray, and the air smells of salt and fish. Life in your small community is slow, predictable. The rhythm of tides and seasons marks time more than the whims of kings. You fish, you tend sheep, you trade with monks, and perhaps journey as far as York. That is, until the longships arrive. The story of the Danelaw does not begin with sweeping conquests or famous kings. It begins with a slow, grinding intrusion so gradual that you might not notice it at first. A boat here, a raiding party there. They come, take, burn, and leave. But then they come again, and again. The first recorded raid. In 793 AD, the monastery at Lindisfarne was attacked by raiders from the sea. This single act would later be mythologized as the beginning of the Viking Age in England. But to those who experienced it, it was simply a terrible day. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle, usually terse in tone, offers a rare moment of alarm. In this year came dreadful forewarnings over the land of the Northumbrians. Immense flashes of lightning and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. A great famine immediately followed these signs, and not long after, in that same year, the harrowing of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne. To most modern readers, dragons are metaphor, but to an Anglo-Saxon monk, the world was a place of signs and omens. Lightning and famine were not coincidences, they were warnings. The attack was a spiritual crisis, not just a military one. Why they came? The Norsemen who launched these early attacks weren't an organized army. They were likely petty chieftains and their warbends men from what is now Norway, facing overpopulation, poor farming conditions, and a system of inheritance that left many young men without land or purpose. England, with its rich monasteries, poorly defended coasts, and treasure-laden churches, must have seemed like an easy mark. It's tempting to imagine these early raids as brutal, mindless violence, but even in their destructiveness, there was method. Monasteries were not just religious centers, they were storehouses of wealth, land deeds, and gold-encrusted relics. Attacking them was as practical as it was symbolic. The response of the Anglo-Saxons. In those first few years, there was no real response. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were divided. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex, all ruled by their own kings, often at odds with each other. Each faced internal struggles, border skirmishes, and political rivalries. The idea of a unified defense was distant. Some kings, like Offa of Mercia, attempted defensive measures, a coinage reform here, a fortified town there. But none could coordinate a sustained defense. It would be years before Wessex, under Alfred the Great, began to build a meaningful strategy. For now, the Norsemen raided with impunity, settling in slowly. Around 830–850 AD, the pattern began to change. Some of the Norse raiders began to winter in England rather than return home. This was a crucial shift. To winter somewhere is to build shelter, store food, and plan for spring, not just to fight, but to survive. In East Anglia and parts of Northumbria, local leaders began to make arrangements with the newcomers. These were not always formal treaties. Sometimes they were informal truces. You don't raid our farms, and we don't try to kill you in your sleep. Gradually, Norse settlements began to appear, nestled into the English landscape like seeds that had fallen by accident, and yet took root all the same. Archaeological evidence supports this transition. Place names ending in by from Old Norse for village, such as Grimsby, Whitby, and Derby, begin to appear in documents. Hoards of silver coins buried in the earth suggest not just plunder, but commerce and fear. Life along the coasts. For the average person in East Anglia or Northumbria, the arrival of the Norse was terrifying but also oddly familiar. These men farmed, fished, traded. They may have looked different, but they often intermarried, learned the language, and followed local customs. Over time, it became harder to tell who was Anglo-Saxon and who was Norse, especially for those born after the invasions. But the tension never fully faded. Local communities lived with the constant knowledge that peace could collapse at any time. A new chieftain might rise, or a foreign king might land with fresh ships. Fear was part of daily life, woven into farming schedules and church services. The great irony is that while we speak of a Viking invasion, much of what followed was not invasion but absorption. Norsemen did not so much conquer as they entered, and then refused to leave. A land in flux. By the 860s, it was clear that something larger was taking shape. The so-called Great Heathen Army, a coalition of Norse forces, landed in East Anglia with the intent not just to raid, but to occupy. Under leaders like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, the army captured key towns and drove back the Anglo-Saxon kings. But this was not a lightning war. It was a slow, deliberate process of conquest and settlement. Fortresses were built, agreements were struck, entire swathes of land were reorganized under Norse leadership. And yet what's most remarkable is not the battles but the silences between them. Years passed with no recorded conflict. During those times, towns were rebuilt, fields were tilled, livestock was traded, life somehow went on. The longships came and they stayed. But the story of how these ships reshaped England is not one of swords alone, it is one of hearths, habits, and hesitant coexistence. As the East Coast shifted beneath the weight of new settlers, what remained of the old kingdoms watched in quiet alarm. What would happen when the Norse reached inland? Would the Danelaw stop at the river valleys, or would it remake all of England? You're now a generation removed from the first landings. The longships are no longer novel. They come less often as raiders and more as transports for families, livestock, and tools. What began as chaos is becoming routine. In fields once worked by Anglo-Saxon hands, Norse plows now cut lines into the soil. And in quiet halls, English nobles meet with Norse jarls to settle disputes not with war, but with words. This is the slow tide of settlement, a creeping wave, not a crashing one. By the mid-860s to 870s, the so-called Great Heathen Army had already set a pattern. Land, winter, raid, retreat, return, and finally stay. The arrival of the Great Heathen Army. Unlike earlier raids, the Great Heathen Army represented coordination. This wasn't a band of adventurers, it was a loose alliance of Norse leaders united under semi-mythic figures like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson. Their motives were complex: vengeance for Ragnar Lodbrok, glory, land acquisition, and perhaps the lure of England's fractured political landscape. East Anglia fell with little resistance. Northumbria, already racked by internal rivalries, was conquered. Mercia, the powerful Midland kingdom, was humbled. The army overwintered, built encampments, and began the work of governance. But conquest was only part of the story. After years of conflict, what emerged was not a Norse-controlled England, but a divided realm. A formal treaty often attributed to King Alfred the Great and Guthrum, the Dane, created a boundary between the Anglo-Saxon-controlled Wessex and the Norse-controlled Danelaw. This boundary wasn't a wall. It was more like a scar, running roughly along the line of Watling Street, an old Roman road. North and east of this, Norse customs would shape daily life. South and west, Alfred's Wessex would hold fast. The burden of coexistence. For those living in the Danelaw, life did not change overnight. The plow still turned the soil. Sheep still grazed on low hills, but the background noise of daily life had changed. The legal language shifted. Taxes were collected differently. Land might be granted under Norse law, which differed subtly but importantly from Anglo-Saxon customs. The Norse brought with them a more decentralized approach to governance. Authority rested less with a distant king and more with local leaders, jarls, and thing assemblies that decided matters communally. This wasn't democracy, but it was consensus-oriented, at least in theory. For Anglo-Saxon peasants under Norse rule, the shift was likely confusing but not catastrophic. Most people were not politically powerful. They simply wanted to survive, tend their fields, and raise their families. If the tax collector spoke Old Norse instead of Old English, that was troubling but not necessarily worse. In some places, these cultural fusions led to shared legal assemblies. In others, they led to friction. The hybridized laws of the Danelaw, the so-called Danelaga, would ultimately reflect a blend of both traditions, codifying a strange, often overlooked example of negotiated coexistence. The rise of the five boroughs. By the late 9th and early 10th centuries, 5 key towns came to define the heart of the Danelaw: Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, and Stamford. These were more than just urban centers. They were defensive hubs, trade nexuses, and cultural melting pots. Together, they are often called the five boroughs. Each borough had its own leadership, typically a jarl or military commander, but they were loosely aligned. These towns shared military coordination and often cooperated on matters of trade or conflict with Wessex. Their proximity to key rivers and Roman roads made them vital for control and communication. In many ways, the five boroughs were the living proof that the Norse were not just conquerors, they were settlers, urban builders, and participants in local economies. These towns were fortified but not isolated. Markets thrived. Slaves were traded. Goods from Ireland, Scandinavia, Francia, and the Islamic world passed through. Imagine yourself in Leicester's marketplace. Old Norse mingles with Old English. A blacksmith sharpens plowshares beside a warrior's sword. A monk counts coinage from a Norse trader. A child born of an Anglo-Saxon mother and a Norse father listens with equal fluency to both languages. Religious compromise and conversion. Religion was one of the most difficult and slowest points of convergence. The Norse were pagans, worshippers of Odin, Thor, and Freyja. The Anglo-Saxons were Christian, nominally unified under Roman and Celtic ecclesiastical structures. Early on, Norse settlers left clear marks of pagan beliefs: grave goods, cremation, carved runestones. But over time, as intermarriage increased and Norse leaders sought legitimacy, conversion to Christianity followed. Guthrum himself was baptized under Alfred's terms after their treaty. But conversion was not always sincere or immediate. Pagan and Christian beliefs often existed side by side. Churches were repurposed. Symbols were blended. A Norse cross might still feature serpents or dragons alongside Christian motifs. The average person in the Danelaw may not have cared deeply which god watched over them so long as their crops grew and their children lived through winter. Language on the border. Perhaps the most invisible and lasting change was linguistic. Old Norse and Old English were not radically different, they shared Germanic roots. Over time, they influenced each other, particularly in vocabulary, place names, and even grammar. Words we use every day: sky, knife, egg, window, husband, law are of Norse origin. Even the pronouns they, them, their come from Norse, replacing native Old English forms. This wasn't a sudden replacement. It was a gradual process born of necessity. People needed to trade, resolve disputes, and marry across language lines. In towns like York, Jorvik, hybrid dialects likely emerged early, blending Norse sounds with English structure. In a way, this linguistic blending is one of the most enduring legacies of the Danelaw. Long after its political borders dissolved, its words remained. Anglo-Saxon resistance and adaptation. Not all responded with cooperation. Wessex, under Alfred and later his successors like Edward the Elder and Ethelfled of Mercia, remained vigilant. They built burghs, fortified towns, and slowly pushed northward. But even they adapted. Wessex began to mint coins that featured both Christian and Norse imagery. They negotiated treaties using Norse terminology, and in some regions retaken from the Danelaw, they retained local Norse administrators rather than purge them. It became clear the Norse had changed England, and even those who resisted were forced to speak the new political language both literally and metaphorically. Everyday life in the Danelaw. What did daily life look like? Farming, the core occupation, remained agriculture. Norse farmers used similar techniques to Anglo-Saxons, though they may have introduced improvements in tools or livestock management. Housing, settlements followed Norse layouts: longhouses, open compounds, shared communal spaces, but these often mixed with local building styles. Law, disputes were handled by local assemblies, things, where men swore oaths, called witnesses, and resolved matters by custom. Trade, the Danelaw was rich in silver, and hoards like the Cúaile hoard show the extent of wealth circulating in the region. Norse traders were savvy and connected. Women, Norse customs may have given women slightly more legal recognition, rights to inheritance or divorce, though this remains debated. And so, by 900 AD, the Danelaw was no longer a foreign imposition. It was simply life for hundreds of thousands of people. Norse and Anglo-Saxon bloodlines mixed, customs blurred, and a new hybrid culture took shape. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Wessex was growing in strength. Alfred's descendants were ambitious, and while the Danelaw had found a way to survive, it had not truly unified. Would this new land hold together or be consumed by the South? You now live in a land that feels strangely stable. It is the early 900s, and if you're a farmer in the Danelaw, your world is organized, predictable, even prosperous. The 5 boroughs are thriving. Trade flows along the rivers. Local assemblies meet to judge disputes. Children grow up speaking a strange, blended tongue, neither fully Norse nor fully English. But while life may feel settled on the surface, larger forces are beginning to shift. In Wessex and Mercia, Alfred the Great's legacy lives on in his children and grandchildren. The tide that once flowed northward with Norsemen is now revering. Quietly, then quickly, the Danelaw begins to unravel. Alfred's legacy and the southern reconquest. Alfred the Great died in 899, having spent much of his reign resisting and outmaneuvering the great heathen army. His military successes, however, were only part of the story. His deeper contribution was laying the foundation for a unified English identity through education reforms, fortifications, legal codifications, and diplomacy. His son, Edward the Elder, and his daughter, Ethelfled of Mercia, continued that legacy. They launched coordinated campaigns to reclaim territory lost to Norse control. Ethelfled, in particular, proved to be a shrewd and effective leader called the Lady of the Mercians. She fortified towns, made alliances, and retook key areas. By the 910s and 920s, Wessex and Mercia had pushed deep into the Danelaw. The 5 boroughs, once the heart of Norse power, began to fall one by one. Derby in 917, Leicester in 918. York was the final prize. The reconquest was not always bloody. In many cases, the towns surrendered peacefully or negotiated terms. The Norse settlers, by then second or third generation, often chose to stay and integrate rather than flee. Few had anywhere to return to in Scandinavia. The Danelaw's slow collapse. By 954 AD, with the expulsion of Eric Bloodaxe from York, the last Norse ruler of any part of England was gone. The Danelaw, as a political entity had ceased to exist. But this end was not dramatic. It did not come through a final, epic battle. Instead, it faded quietly, absorbed into the expanding kingdom of England. Borders were redrawn, laws rewritten, and local leaders replaced. Some Norse jarls became ealdormen, others simply vanished from the record. Importantly, the culture of the Danelaw did not disappear overnight. The process of assimilation was slow. Laws were blended, language evolved, place names endured, and many Norse customs, especially in law and local governance, remained embedded in English life for generations. Even after political control shifted, the Danelaw continued as a concept, used to describe regions governed by Norse law for tax and legal purposes. The term remained in use in royal charters well into the 11th century. Cultural residue and lasting chain. What did the Danelaw leave behind? 1. Place names. The most visible legacy of the Danelaw is geographic. Towns and villages across northern and eastern England bear Norse names. Grimsby, Whitby, Derby, farm or settlement. Thorpe, Scunthorpe, Althorpe, outlying farm. Thwaite, Applethwaite, clearing. Toft, Lowestoft, homestead. These names are not just decorative. They reflect real settlement patterns, mapping where Norse communities took hold. 2. Legal traditions. While many of the Norse legal practices were eventually absorbed or overwritten, some features like local assemblies, things, and collective oaths resonated with existing Anglo-Saxon traditions and helped shape English common law. The idea of local responsibility, especially for crimes and fines, was bolstered under Danelaw norms. 3. Language. As mentioned earlier, English vocabulary is deeply influenced by Norse. Everyday words like knife, sky, law, ill, and egg, even basic pronouns like they and them, are Norse in origin. This hybridization began in the Danelaw and spread across the country as the population mixed. 4. Genetic legacy. Modern genetic studies have revealed traces of Norse ancestry, particularly in the areas once part of the Danelaw. This does not mean that today's English people are part Viking in any simplistic sense, but it does affirm the long-term integration of Norse settlers into the population. 5. Religious art and burial practices. Carvings on Christian crosses in the north often show a fusion of pagan and Christian symbols. Graves in Danelaw regions sometimes contain both Christian artifacts and traditional Norse grave goods. This syncretism was part of the cultural negotiation between settlers and locals. A land once divided. The story of the Danelaw is not one of conquest and domination, it's one of accommodation, coexistence, and compromise. It was, above all, a negotiated space. Kings might have drawn borders, but ordinary people did the hard work of living together. For decades, Norse and Anglo-Saxon communities shared land, traded goods, intermarried, and argued over boundaries and livestock. Some communities clung to old identities. Others blurred them. Over time, the question of who was Norse and who was English became harder to answer. It is this slow merging, not the dramatic battles, that defines the Danelaw's legacy. And perhaps that's why it is often forgotten. History loves its heroes and villains, its victories and defeats. But the Danelaw is made of quieter things. Agreements, marriages, harvests, laws passed in small assemblies, and the daily compromises of people trying to survive. The Normans and the final transformation. In 1066, less than a century after the Danelaw's official end, another invasion would reshape England forever: the Norman conquest. Ironically, the Normans were themselves descendants of Norsemen who had settled in northern France. When William the Conqueror claimed the English throne, he brought with him a legal and cultural revolution that swept away many remnants of Anglo-Saxon and Danelaw traditions. Yet even the Normans could not erase everything. The place names endured, so did the language, and in local customs and dialects, echoes of the Danelaw remained. A quiet ending. You live in a village near Stamford now. The year is 975. You speak a dialect rich with Norse words. You pay your taxes to a king in the south, but your local reeve still settles disputes the old way. On Sundays, you pray in a church whose cross bears serpents and saints alike. The raiders your grandfather feared are long gone. The land has quieted. The Danelaw, once a line of division, has dissolved into the soil. And while it may not be remembered in grand statues or epic tales, it lives on in the way people speak, trade, and carry the memory of names older than kings. What does it mean when an invasion ends not with destruction, but with blending? And how often in history do the conquerors become the ancestors? Story 2. From raiders to settlers, the shift from plunder to plow. The year is 871, and the sword is growing dull. You are the son of a Norse raider, born not on the cold fjords of Norway, but on the fens of East Anglia. Your father's hands are calloused, but not from war. They are shaped by the haft of an axe that now fells trees, not soldiers. The longships still sit by the riverbank, but they are dry-docked, half forgotten. The world of plunder is beginning to give way to something else: permanence. This section of our journey through the Danelaw focuses not on conquest, but on what came after. How, over time, a generation of warriors became farmers, merchants, landowners, and lawmakers. This transformation from raiders to settlers is subtle, complex, and quietly revolutionary. The end of the era of endless raids. For nearly a century, the Norse presence in England had been defined by violence. From Lindisfarne in 793 to the wintering of the Great Heathen Army in the 860s, the invaders came primarily to take wealth, land, and prestige. Their attacks were brutal, sudden, and largely unresisted thanks to the fractured Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. But violence is not sustainable. Even the fiercest raider eventually grows old, and even plunder runs dry. As the Norse leaders began to carve out stable territories in East Anglia, Northumbria, and parts of Mercia, the costs of continued raiding became evident. Land needed to be governed. Families needed to be fed. New generations were being born not in Scandinavia, but in England. And these new generations, your generation, did not know the old world. They knew the soil beneath their feet, and they began to care for it. The shift in priorities. So what caused the change from raiders to settlers? One, land ownership and fertility. Much of Scandinavia, particularly Norway, was mountainous and had limited arable land. Only a small elite could inherit productive farms. For younger sons, war and raiding were often the only paths to wealth. England, by contrast, was green, mild, and fertile. Its river valleys promised wheat, barley, and livestock far more reliable than uncertain sea voyages. Settling meant security. Land could be tilled, divided, passed on. Cattle could be raised. Orchards could grow. 2. Political alliances and treaties. Treaties between Norse leaders and Anglo-Saxon kings, including Alfred's famous treaty with Guthrum, often granted land in exchange for peace. These land grants weren't just temporary, they implied governance. A jarl with territory needed administrators, farmers, and craftsmen. He could not simply leave every winter to raid elsewhere. 3. Intermarriage and cultural mixing. Settling brought families. Norse men married Anglo-Saxon women. Children were raised in bilingual households. Traditions blended. With time, the desire to raid one's neighbors diminished, especially when they were kin. 4. Diminishing returns of raiding. As towns fortified and defenses improved, raids became more costly. The burr system in Wessex made quick attacks nearly impossible. Fortified towns offered few spoils and stiff resistance. Wealth was no longer easily taken, it had to be built. Archaeological evidence of settlement. The physical remains of this transformation are striking. Longhouses began appearing in English villages, particularly in Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and East Anglia. These structures, wide, Single-room dwellings shared by family and animals were Scandinavian in design, but built with local materials. Field systems show Norse influence in how land was divided, particularly in strip fields and communal pastures. Metalworking sites and blacksmithing evidence appear near Norse settlements, suggesting a rise in local production tools, horseshoes, and domestic goods, not just weapons. Graves shift from warrior-style burials with swords and shields to more modest interments, often Christian in nature, but still bearing the subtle markers of Norse identity. Coins and trade tokens found in these areas show a transition from hoarding silver to using it, proof that a stable economy was developing. The emergence of Norse towns. We must dispel the myth of Vikings as purely rural settlers. Many of them helped shape urban life in England. In places like York, Jorvik, Norse settlers revitalized urban centers that had lain dormant since Roman times. Jorvik became a booming trade hub by the late 9th century. Excavations from the Coppergate area reveal workshops producing combs, leather goods, and metalwork. Imports from the Carolingian Empire, Ireland, and the Islamic caliphates. Evidence of urban planning, gridded streets, drainage systems, and structured markets. Here, Norse settlers weren't warriors. They were merchants, craftsmen, and guild members. They bargained in Norse and Old English. They used scales and weights, not swords and axes. Social transformation, the rise of the bondi. In Norse society, a bondi was a free man, a landowner, but not a noble. This class would become the backbone of the Danelaw. Unlike in feudal systems where vassals owed military service for land, the bondi was independent, with duties to his local assembly thing, not to a distant lord. The emergence of a large bondi class in England meant greater local autonomy, less reliance on centralized military power, a society built around community self-governance rather than strict hierarchy. This is one of the quiet revolutions of the Danelaw. It gave voice and power to free landholders, and many of their legal customs would survive long after the Danelaw disappeared. Agriculture and everyday work. The image of a Norseman planting barley may seem odd, but that became the norm. Plowing. Norse settlers introduced heavy plows suited for dense English clay. Animal husbandry. Sheep and cattle were central, not just for food but for trade. Wool, especially, was becoming a major export. Seasonal routines. Spring planting, summer tending, autumn harvest, winter repair. The cycle of the year shaped every part of life. Community cooperation. Large tasks like fence building, thatching, or harvest hauling were shared, often followed by feasts or religious rites. This work may seem dull, but it was foundational. The Danelaw's true strength lay not in its warriors, but in the thousands of anonymous men and women who coaxed food from the land. The decline of the warrior class. Not all Norsemen welcomed this shift. To some, it was a betrayal of tradition. Young men raised on tales of Ragnarok and glory found themselves mending roofs and shearing sheep. Chieftains who once led raids were now bound by charters, local disputes, and Christian sermons. Some left. They returned to Norway or sailed to Ireland, France, or even further to Iceland or the Rus. Others adapted, embracing their new roles as landlords and lawgivers. It is in this generation caught between axe and plow that the identity of the Norsemen began to change. The Danelaw was no longer a staging ground for conquest. It was home. The great irony. Herein lies the paradox of the Danelaw's creation. It began in blood. Longships burned villages. Monasteries were sacked. Kings were slain. But its legacy, what endured, was not war. It was the quiet act of settling. The Danelaw became a place where children no longer learned to raid, but to farm. Gods changed, Odin faded, Christ ascended. Languages mingled until distinctions blurred. Laws became tools for peace, not vengeance. What began as the end for many Anglo-Saxons became a beginning for something new. And this transformation, this slow, nearly invisible shift would shape English identity forever. So now you sit in a mead hall in the heart of the Danelaw. Your father was a warrior. You are a landholder. Your son may become a merchant or a priest. The blade has dulled. The plowshare shines. But can a society born of conquest truly survive without war? And what happens when the warriors of old become the rulers of today? Imagine, if you will, a small gathering at the edge of a village near Stamford. A circle of men, some in woolen cloaks, others in worn tunics, stand among low timber homes, surrounded by barley fields and bleating sheep. At the center of the circle is a raised stone where disputes are settled, oaths are sworn, and decisions are made. There are no written laws here, only memory, custom, and the weight of community. This is the thing, the Norse assembly, and it is the bedrock of local governance in the Danelaw. In this section, we leave behind the battlefield and enter the court field, the space where raiders became lawmakers and violence gave way to negotiation. It is here, in these local legal assemblies and everyday customs, that the Danelaw truly took shape, not just as a place, but as a way of life. What was the Danelaw really? The term Danelaw can be misleading. It was not a separate kingdom, nor a single legal system. Instead, it referred to a region where Danish or Norse legal customs held sway instead of the Anglo-Saxon laws used in Wessex and the South. The term itself appears in the 11th century, well after the Norse arrival, and was used to distinguish between different systems of property, justice, and authority. It was not a map line, it was a cultural and legal zone. The Danelaw existed wherever Norse settlers and their descendants governed according to their own norms. The Norse thing, law by assembly, the most important legal institution, was the thing, a local gathering of free men who debated issues, judged cases, and made decisions. Who attended? All free landowning men bondi. Women, slaves, and the landless were excluded. What did it decide? Property disputes, theft, violence, trade disagreements, and issues of inheritance. How did it work? There were no lawyers or written statutes. Judgment was passed based on custom, witness testimony, and communal agreement. Enforcement. Those who ignored judgments risked outlawry, a legal status that made them fair game for violence and denied all legal protection. Unlike feudal courts under Norman rule, the thing emphasized community-based justice. It reflected a society where loyalty was to kin and neighbors, not distant monarchs. Decisions weren't handed down, they were reached together. Trial by oath and ordeal. A peculiar but essential part of Norse legal tradition was the oath. If accused of a crime, a person could prove innocence not by evidence, but by swearing an oath supported by oath helpers, usually 6-12 men, who vouched for the accused's integrity. This practice, called compurgation, required an individual to carry a good reputation in the community. A man known for dishonesty would find no one to stand beside him. Serious crimes might be judged by ordeal, a trial by fire or water. If a man's wounds healed cleanly, he was considered innocent. These rituals, while harsh, were taken as signs of divine judgment, especially as Christian influence grew. Wergild, the price of a life. Norse and Anglo-Saxon law alike used the concept of wergild, a value placed on a person's life, payable in compensation if they were killed or injured. A free man had a set wergild. A slave's value was less. A noble's value was higher. If someone killed a man, they could avoid a blood feud by paying the proper amount to his kin. The point wasn't justice in a modern sense, it was stability. Wergild allowed disputes to be resolved without endless cycles of vengeance. It recognized the realities of human violence and offered a way to contain it. Law and land. As the Norse transitioned from raiders to landowners, land tenure became a legal and social concern. Ownership was tied to one's standing in the community. Owning land made you a bondi, and only bondies could vote at the thing. Inheritance followed Norse customs. Land was typically divided among sons, though daughters could inherit if no sons survived. Land records were rarely written. Instead, oral agreements, witnessed by community members, held legal weight. Over time, charters and documents, especially in regions under Anglo-Saxon influence, began to formalize these agreements. But for much of the Danelaw, memory and testimony remained the currency of legal truth. Women and the law in the Danelaw. One often overlooked aspect of Danelaw society is the legal standing of women. Compared to Anglo-Saxon England, and certainly compared to later Norman rule, Norse women had notable legal agency. Women could inherit property, manage farms, and appear in legal disputes. Widows retained control of their dowries and could remarry without male approval. Women could divorce their husbands for reasons such as abandonment or abuse, and retain their own property after doing so. This is not to idealize Danelaw gender dynamics. Women were still second-class citizens in many ways, but in certain legal aspects, Norse customs granted them more autonomy than their Anglo-Saxon counterparts. Christianity and the shaping of law. As Norse settlers converted to Christianity, new legal ideas blended with the old. Churches began to record births, marriages, and deaths, offering a new kind of legal documentation. Moral laws, such as those against adultery or blasphemy, began to enter local codes. Priests became legal advisors, helping communities navigate increasingly complex customs. Still, the Norse settlers were practical. Many communities observed dual systems: local law for everyday matters, church law for moral and family disputes. This blending of secular and spiritual justice helped the Danelaw evolve into a society not only governed by tradition, but shaped by belief. Law and identity: what made a Danelaw man? In a world of blurred borders and intermarriage, identity was increasingly legal, not ethnic. To be Norse was not to speak a language or follow a god, it was to live under Norse law. You could be born of mixed heritage and still be Danish if you attended the thing, paid your fines, and knew the customs. This concept of identity through legal affiliation would influence later English law. In a sense, being part of the Danelaw was less about who you were and more about which law you followed. Tensions and transitions. Despite its functionality, Danelaw law was not static. Over time, Anglo-Saxon customs re-entered the region, especially after Alfred's reconquests. Royal edicts from the kings of Wessex began to apply across England, even in formerly autonomous areas. Legal documents began to use both Old Norse and Old English terminology, showing the patchwork nature of governance. Still, even under growing pressure from the South, Danelaw communities retained remarkable legal independence for decades. The slow centralization. By the early 10th century, Wessex had reconquered most of the Danelaw territories. But even then, the kings of England often allowed Norse customs to persist, especially in areas like York, Lincolnshire, and the East Midlands. This was a strategy of pragmatism, not mercy. Overhauling local law would have created rebellion. Letting things continue so long as taxes were paid and loyalty declared kept the peace. But this tolerance was not forever. Over the coming decades, as power centralized and England moved toward a single kingdom, the thing assemblies weakened. Royal courts, writs, and sheriffs began to replace local consensus. The law behind the plow began to yield to the pen of the king. You still meet at the thing each season, but the crowd is smaller. The king's reeve now watches from the edge of the circle, arms crossed, nodding names. The last time you tried to settle a boundary dispute, you were told it would be referred to Winchester. The law that once gave voice to the land is growing quiet. But what happens when the traditions of local justice fade? Who speaks for the plowman when his stone circle disappears? By the mid-10th century, the fields of East Anglia are full of ghosts. Not spirits or phantoms, but memories. Beneath each furrowed line of soil lies the imprint of a quiet revolution. Where once Norse raiders waded ashore bearing axes and shields, their descendants now walk barefoot among rows of barley. The longships are gone, the war banners packed away, but the influence of the settlers has only deepened. This final section explores how the Norse transformation from invaders to agricultural settlers left a permanent mark on England, one that endured long after the political entity of the Danelaw dissolved. These roots, buried in law, culture, language, and land, still shape the contours of English life. A settled landscape. The most visible legacy of the Norse settlers is the land itself. Long after battles were forgotten, the patterns of rural life remained. Field systems in the former Danelaw regions show distinct layouts, often with open field strip farming and shared common pastures. Settlements followed Scandinavian models, dispersed farmsteads, small clusters of longhouses, and homesteads with outbuildings. Drainage systems in lowland areas, especially the fens, suggest planned agriculture and communal effort. The Norse were not just surviving, they were shaping the environment. In many areas, you could tell where the Danelaw had been, not by ruins or fortresses, but by how the land was used, how it was owned, and who lived on it. A mixed people. As generations passed, Norse and Anglo-Saxon bloodlines blurred. Children were born speaking both Old Norse and Old English, often within the same household. Mixed marriages were common by the second generation of settlement, especially in market towns and border villages. Surnames began to reflect both traditions. Names ending in son, Norse, appear alongside traditional Anglo-Saxon patronymics. Physical anthropology shows no clear separation between the populations by the 10th century. The result was not a divided society, but a blended one. Norse identity, once defined by difference, had become local. The raiders were now neighbors, kin, and kinship more than conquest shaped the New England. Towns as economic centers. The growth of towns like Jorvik, York, Lincoln, and Norwich turned the Danelaw into a commercial zone, not just an agricultural one. These towns became centers for wool production, leatherworking, and metalwork, maintained trade links with Scandinavia, Ireland, and Francia, minted coins bearing Norse inscriptions and Christian symbols, a dual identity in metal, hosted markets governed by local customs but increasingly regulated by royal decree as Wessex expanded north. Trade, more than warfare, integrated the Danelaw into the wider English realm. The Norse settlers didn't just grow food, they exported culture, imported goods, and sustained an economic network that reached across the known world. Religious integration. By the 950s, most of the Danelaw population was nominally Christian. Churches dotted the landscape, often built on or near former pagan sacred sites, but the faith of the settlers was practical. Christianity was adopted gradually, often alongside older Norse beliefs. Burial practices retained old elements such as grave goods, even within Christian cemeteries. Norse gods lingered in folktales and oaths, often quietly fused with local saints. Priests from Wessex and Mercia sometimes complained about backward faith in the Danelaw communities where mass attendance was irregular, or where saints' relics were treated with more curiosity than reverence. Still, the church became part of daily life. It mediated disputes, recorded births and marriages, and provided access to broader networks of power. By embracing Christianity, the Norse settlers secured their place in the fabric of English society. Linguistic legacy. Language may be the most enduring gift of the Danelaw. Old Norse didn't replace Old English, but it reshaped it. Place names still mark the boundaries of Norse influence. Farm, Whitby, Grimsby, Rugby. Thorpe Village, Scunthorpe, Mablethorpe. Thwaite Clearing, Braithwaite. Toft Homestead, Lowestoft. Everyday vocabulary, expanded with Norse contributions. Legal, law, outlaw, jury. Household, knife, window, egg. Nature, sky, dirt, fog. Emotions and actions, get, take, give, die, anger. Pronouns, they, them, their. This isn't linguistic domination, it's adaptation. English changed not because of conquest, but because communities needed to understand one another. Legal and social residue. Though Wessex eventually brought the Danelaw under its control, Norse customs left legal echoes. The concept of jury by peers drawn from the Thing assembly parallels early English trial practices. Tithings and hundreds, local administrative units, mirror Norse ideas of collective responsibility. In parts of the former Danelaw, Norse-influenced law codes were still referenced as late as the 12th century. Even the concept of common law, a shared legal foundation derived from precedent and custom, owes something to the Danelaw's oral, case-based traditions. The Danelaw's dissolution. The Danelaw didn't end with a single event, it faded. As Wessex kings expanded, they imposed their legal and administrative systems. Bishops from the south began standardizing Christianity. Royal sheriffs replaced local jarls. Over generations, Norse identity softened into regional Englishness. But even after the Norman conquest of 1066, the regions of the old Danelaw retained their distinct character. The Normans, descendants of Norsemen themselves, found a population already shaped by Scandinavian rule. Domesday Book records from 1086 show the lingering dual structure. Anglo-Saxon estates next to Norse freeholds, Latin script recording names of Norse origin. The Danelaw was gone, but it had become England. A quiet revolution. We often think of history in terms of battles and kings, but the Danelaw teaches us something else. Change takes root quietly. Not in courtrooms, but in village assemblies. Not in monasteries, but in fields and workshops. Not through laws imposed from above, but through customs negotiated from below. The Norsemen who once burned churches and took slaves became neighbors and fathers, merchants and magistrates. They changed England not by conquest but by presence. You stand now at the edge of a barley field in Lincolnshire. The sun is low. Your daughter runs ahead, singing in a tongue you can barely understand, a mix of the old language and the new. Your house bears carvings of dragons, but a cross hangs inside. Your fields are marked by stones older than memory. You have lived here your whole life. And you wonder, when did this stop being the land of someone else? When did it become ours? Story 3. A treaty at the edge of a sword, the division of England. It is the year 878, and the fog has not yet lifted. You are a soldier in King Alfred's army, wrapped in a rough woolen cloak, your spear shaft slick with dew. All around you is the stifling silence of the English countryside, broken only by the distant sounds of hooves, the creak of leather, and the shuffle of men too exhausted to pray. This is Chippenham in Wessex, where the final blow nearly fell. This is where Alfred the Great nearly lost his kingdom, and where the road to the Danelaw's formal birth began. This story is not about a single treaty signing in some grand hall. It is about a long chain of events, battles, negotiations, and strategic withdrawals that culminated in a line across England. A line drawn not with ink, but with fire, fear, and blood. A boundary that marked the start of something unprecedented in English history. A land split not only by geography, but by law, custom, and identity. The context of collapse. By the late 870s, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had been ravaged. Northumbria was fractured. Mercia was in disarray. East Anglia, once a proud kingdom, was now a Norse enclave. Wessex alone remained relatively intact but barely. The great heathen army, led by the sons of Ragnar Lodbrok, including the formidable Guthrum, had swept through England like a storm. Their tactics were strategic, not merely violent. They overwintered in conquered lands, fortified key settlements, and made local alliances. By early 878, the Norse had pushed deep into Wessex, capturing Chippenham, a royal estate and key winter refuge. King Alfred fled with a small band of loyalists into the marshes of Athelney, a remote and waterlogged region. From here, he launched guerrilla-style resistance, striking swiftly, then disappearing into the reeds. It was a low point not just for Alfred, but for Anglo-Saxon England itself. The vision of a unified Christian kingdom seemed to hang by a thread. The turning point, Battle of Edington. In the spring of 878, Alfred rallied his forces. He called upon the Field, the Anglo-Saxon militia across the shires still loyal to him. He gathered men not just to fight, but to survive. Farmers took up spears. Former monks strapped on belts of leather. Shepherds and reeves became soldiers overnight. The decisive clash came at Edington. Alfred's army met Guthrum's forces in a battle of attrition. The exact details are lost, but the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes a fierce engagement that ended with the Norse being driven into a fortress and starved into submission. Rather than wipe out the defeated enemy, Alfred chose diplomacy. This decision, quiet, strategic, and ultimately historic, led to the Treaty of Wedmore, which would reshape England. The Treaty of Wedmore, 878. The treaty was not written immediately. It was more a verbal agreement sealed by a symbolic act. Guthrum, the pagan Norse king, agreed to convert to Christianity. He was baptized with Alfred as his godfather and took the Christian name Ethelstan. The conversion served multiple purposes. Legitimacy. It allowed Guthrum to rule his territory with Christian acceptance. Diplomacy. It bound the two rulers in a spiritual alliance. Stability. It opened the door for future peace and cohabitation. But the real transformation came later. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum, c. 886-890. Sometime between 886 and 890, a formal written treaty was drafted. It is here that the Danelaw, though not yet called by that name, begins to take shape. Key provisions of the treaty included territorial division. The treaty drew a line from the River Thames up to the River Lee, and then north along Watling Street, a Roman road, and beyond to Chester. Lands to the east and north of this line would be under Guthrum's control, essentially what would become known as the Danelaw. Lands to the south and west remained Alfred. Mutual legal recognition. Both parties agreed to uphold certain common legal standards, especially in matters of trade and blood compensation, Wergild. The laws were drawn from Anglo-Saxon and Norse traditions, indicating a recognition of legal pluralism. Standardized coinage and trade terms. To facilitate commerce between their territories, they agreed on the weight and purity of silver in coins. Trade was to be regulated and taxed, showing a desire to move from plunder to structured economic relations. Mercantile security. Merchants crossing into each other's territory had to be registered and accompanied by legal witnesses. This was a way to prevent espionage and theft, and to monitor population movement. Rules on hostages and oaths. Hostages were exchanged. Oaths sworn on Christian relics became binding, reflecting Alfred's desire to pull Norse leaders into Christian moral frameworks. Why the treaty mattered. To a modern observer, the treaty might seem modest, just a set of border and trade terms. But in the fractured, chaotic political landscape of 9th century England, it represented something remarkable. A codified truce between a Christian Anglo-Saxon king and a pagan-turned-Christian Norse leader. An acknowledgement of separate legal spheres, effectively, two Englands within one island. a step away from a cycle of raids and retaliation, toward something like coexistence. This was not a surrender, nor was it a victory. It was a compromise forged at the edge of collapse. Life on the border. For those living near the new boundary, often close to waddling street life, became a balancing act. Laws differed on either side. A thief might be punished with compensation in the Danelaw, but mutilation or execution in Wessex. Marriages between people from opposite sides required negotiation not just between families, but sometimes between local authorities. In marketplaces, coinage had to be weighed and verified. Norse traders used hack silver, silver weighed in chunks, while Wessex coins were stamped and regulated. Border villages became bilingual, bicultural, and often bireligious. These were not zones of chaos, but of creative tension, places where two worlds rubbed against each other and new ideas were born. The symbolism of the treaty. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum didn't just divide land. It created a model of negotiated identity. The idea that people of different faiths, customs, and languages could live under separate but cooperative rule was revolutionary in early medieval Europe. Of course, the peace was uneasy. There were later skirmishes. Treaties were broken. But the idea of the Danelaw endured for decades, formalized not by royal propaganda but by the lived experience of thousands who built homes, raised families, and followed unfamiliar laws. You live in a village near Watling Street now. The river cuts the land in half and your cousins live on the other side. Your village elder says you're English. Your neighbor calls himself a Dane, but you both fish in the same stream. You trade calves at the same fair. You bury your dead in fields your grandfathers cleared. The kings may have drawn a line, but how long can that line hold? And what happens when the law becomes more familiar than the sword? The year is 895. The fighting has paused for now. The fields are quiet. A child tosses a pebble across the River Lee, unaware that this waterway, gentle and winding, marks the border of kingdoms. On one bank lies land ruled by King Alfred of Wessex, Anglo-Saxon, Christian, organized under burghs and charters. On the other bank, the Danelaw begins, Norse-dominated territory, governed by different laws, customs, and rhythms. Between these worlds lies a fragile strip of life, a living border where both identities touch and often tangle. This section explores what it meant to live along that invisible but very real line carved across England by the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum. While the treaty defined terms for rulers, it was in the daily compromises of ordinary people that the Danelaw truly became a functioning reality. An uneasy peace. The peace brokered between Alfred and Guthrum was not absolute. It was conditional, provisional, and always vulnerable to collapse. Raiding didn't stop entirely, it simply changed shape. Independent warbands, unaffiliated with Guthrum's regime, continued to strike into Wessex. Some Anglo-Saxon lords refused to accept the division, staging local uprisings. Guthrum himself, baptized and renamed Ethelstan, struggled to control all Norse factions within his territory. But in many areas along the new border zone, day-to-day life demanded pragmatism. Peace was not upheld by kings, it was maintained by neighbors. Villages like St. Albans, Bedford, or Northampton straddling key river crossings or ancient Roman roads became informal meeting points, where merchants, messengers, and settlers from both sides coexisted. Borderland communities, two worlds, one roof. These were the contact zones of the early medieval world, places where culture was not just exchanged, but lived. Language. In some households, Old Norse and Old English were spoken interchangeably. Children grew up code switching depending on which elder they were speaking to. Faith. Christian churches stood alongside older Norse religious shrines. Newly converted Norse families attended Mass but still told tales of Thor and Odin by the hearth. Marriage. intermarriage became common. An Anglo-Saxon woman might marry a Norse landholder, her children raised in both traditions, inheriting land from both lineages. Customs, legal disputes were sometimes settled by Anglo-Saxon standards, sometimes by Norse ones. The choice might depend on whose land the dispute occurred on or who could gather more witnesses. This cultural mingling was not seamless. Tensions flared, especially over issues like property rights and inheritance. But the longer the treaty held, the more these hybrid arrangements became normalized. Law at the border. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum contained legal stipulations, but enforcement on the ground was improvised. Local assemblies, markets, and churches played critical roles in making the treaty real. Trade law. Traders crossing the border needed witnesses. Each merchant was supposed to register at a local market, sometimes offering hostages or swearing oaths to avoid being mistaken for spies. Norse traders used hack silver cut and weighed silver as currency. Wessex had minted coins, stamped with royal faces and standardized weights. At border markets, scales were common. Disputes about silver weight were frequent. Trusted money weighers became important community figures. Criminal law. Justice varied by region. Consider this example. A Norse man kills a thief on his land. Under Danelaw, this is justified self-defense. In Wessex, the same act might require wurgle to the thief's kin or risk outlawry. Cases like these created tension. Some communities developed hybrid codes, crafting rules through custom rather than royal edict. The border regions became legal laboratories, places where local justice mattered more than distant kings. Fortifications and watchfulness. Though peace held for many years, neither side truly trusted the other. Wessex constructed and maintained burghs, fortified towns, connected by a network of roads and mustering points. Along the Danelaw's edge, watchposts and lookouts were built, often manned by local levies rather than royal troops. These defenses were not purely military, they were psychological. They reminded both sides that while cooperation was possible, vigilance was necessary. Travelers crossing the line faced questions. Who sent you? Where are you going? Are you here for trade or for something else? Cultural exchange and imitation. Ironically, the longer the border remained, the more similar the two sides became. Peace bred imitation. Wessex began adopting some Norse legal practices like local assemblies with broader participation, or more flexible inheritance rules. The Danelaw, in turn, gradually adopted Christian symbols, monastic patronage, and royal coinage practices. Even architecture began to blend. Anglo-Saxon stone churches influenced Norse builders. Norse longhouse layouts appeared in southern villages. The border had become less a wall and more a membrane, porous, dynamic, and always shifting. The border in the mind. Despite cooperation and mingling, the idea of the border retained powerful symbolism. It defined identity in new ways. A man living under Danelaw might be proud of local autonomy and Norse customs. His cousin across the river might declare loyalty to Alfred, speak Old English, and refer to Norsemen as pagans, even if they shared the same grandfather. Identity became as much a matter of law and loyalty as language or blood. The treaty had unintentionally created two mental Englands, each shaping its people in different ways. Trouble from the north and the sea. As the 9th century drew to a close, new threats emerged. Norse raiders from Ireland, often Danes who had settled in Dublin, began arriving on England's western shores. Norsemen from Norway still sailed from across the sea, less interested in treaties than treasure. Eric Bloodaxe, a future claimant to the Northumbrian throne, would one day plunge the region into renewed turmoil. The peace along the Alfred-Guthrum line remained, but it was increasingly strained. Alfred's successors, Edward the Elder, Ethelfled, and eventually Athelstan would seek not just to defend the line, but to erase it. But for now the border holds, just. You stand on a ridge near Watling Street looking out over pasture and tilled earth. To the east you see stone churches. To the west the curve of a Norse-style roof. You were born here, so were your parents. The line runs through your village, your fields, perhaps even your family. You ask yourself, am I one of them, one of us? Or are we something new? The border is still there, on the maps and in the minds of kings. But to the farmer in Lindsay or the weaver in Bedford, the Danelaw is not a political line, it is home. By the early 900s, what had once been a bold experiment in dual sovereignty, a kingdom of two customs, two languages, and two laws was beginning to dissolve. Not in a single moment, nor by dramatic conquest, but through the slow work of unification. This final section traces the unmaking of the Danelaw not by erasure, but by absorption. The line drawn by Alfred and Guthrum would disappear not in fire or rebellion, but in marriage charters, royal decrees, market taxes, and the wear of 1,000 footsteps across a common road. The rise of Wessex. After Alfred's death in 899, Wessex was no longer merely a kingdom. It had become a mission. His son, Edward the Elder, and his daughter, Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, led a deliberate campaign to reclaim and integrate former Danelaw territories. But their strategy was measured and methodical. They fortified burhs along borderlands at Chester, Manchester, Warwick, and beyond, gradually pushing the line north and east. Rather than expel Norse inhabitants, they offered terms of submission. Keep your land, keep your customs, swear loyalty to the English crown. Strategic marriages, alliances, and oaths stitched former Norse strongholds back into the growing English realm. This wasn't military conquest in the traditional sense, it was administrative encirclement. The Danelaw became a collection of semi-independent provinces, increasingly governed through Wessex law, coinage, and religion. The death of Guthrum's legacy. Guthrum baptized Aethelstan ruled East Anglia peacefully after the Treaty of Wedmore. But after his death, sometime in the late 880s or early 890s, no figure of similar stature emerged. Successor rulers lacked Guthrum's political shrewdness. Infighting among Norse warlords weakened the cohesion of Danelaw leadership. Some jarls sought alliances with Wessex for their own security or benefit. Without a strong central authority, the Danelaw fractured. Each region responded to Wessex's advance differently. Some resisted, others welcomed integration. The 5 boroughs, the final holdouts. Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, and Stamford, the so-called 5 boroughs, had once formed the heart of the Danelaw. But by the early 10th century, they faced growing pressure. Edward the Elder recaptured Derby and Leicester in 917. Ethelfled negotiated the peaceful surrender of Nottingham and Stamford. Lincoln fell soon after, not by siege but by submission. These towns remained culturally Norse for some time. They retained their market customs, local assemblies, and place names, but they now paid taxes to the English crown. Their leaders swore fealty. Their laws slowly began to mirror those of Wessex. The Danelaw, at least in any political sense, was disappearing. The symbolism of Athelstan. The final stroke came with King Athelstan, grandson of Alfred, who became the first ruler to formally call himself King of the English. Athelstan was not content with mere reunification. He aimed for nationhood. He standardized coinage across all regions, including the former Danelaw. He called synods and councils that included Norse-descended nobles. He enforced a common law code that blended Wessex and Danelaw traditions. His 927 conquest of York, the last major Norse stronghold, marked the true end of Norse political independence in England. But Athelstan didn't raise York. He didn't punish the Norse elite. He incorporated them, offering land, titles, and influence in exchange for allegiance. His reign represents the culmination of quiet assimilation. The border was now gone in all but memory. The Danelaw becomes an idea. Even as it faded from maps, the Danelaw lived on in culture and consciousness. Legal traditions persisted. In former Danelaw regions, local courts still followed customary procedures distinct from southern England. Place names, dialects, and folk traditions maintained Norse roots. The term Danelaw itself would be recorded in 11th century charters and legal codes, not as a region of resistance, but as a jurisdictional category. In essence, the Danelaw became less a realm and more a legal memory, a way to describe how things were done up there. Even William the Conqueror would later issue distinct legal pronouncements for the old Danelaw regions, acknowledging their unique character centuries after the treaty that birthed them. The quiet victors. There's a final irony in the story of the Danelaw's fall. It succeeded. Though the Norse lost their kings and territories, they gained something more durable, a place in the soul of England. English law became a tapestry of Anglo-Saxon and Norse threads. The English language bears the imprint of Old Norse in its pronouns, syntax, and everyday words. The political idea of local self-governance, expressed through thing-like assemblies, would survive long after Norman centralization. The Danelaw taught England how to absorb invaders, how to coexist with difference, and how to forge unity from fracture. The people who remembered. In borderland villages, old customs lingered. Families passed down stories not of battles but of the line. The road where tolls changed. The hill where laws shifted. The river where languages blended. Some still called themselves Danes, well into the 11th century, not because they had sailed from Norway, but because their grandfather had used Norse words, and their father still followed Danelaw customs. In time, these identities would dissolve into Englishness, but for a few generations, the memory of the Danelaw remained alive in soil, speech, and silence. You walk now along the path once called Waddling Street. There is no border here. The hedgerows grow the same on either side. The accent of the farmer at the market is hard to place, half southern, half northern. He trades in coin. He speaks of the king. He remembers that his grandmother used to say buy instead of farm. There is no line anymore, but you still feel it like an old scar. And you wonder, when a border fades, does it disappear? Or does it simply become part of who we are? Story 4, 5 Boroughs and a Kingdom, the backbone of the Danelaw. You are standing just outside the walls of Lincoln, sometime around 910 AD. The city is alive with sound hammering from blacksmiths, the shouts of market vendors in both Old Norse and Old English, and the steady rhythm of hooves on cobbled roads. Smoke curls from workshops. Banners flap in the wind, bearing dragons and crosses. This is not a frontier town. This is the heart of the Danelaw. And it is not alone. Alongside Lincoln, 4 other towns, Derby, Leicester, Nottingham, and Stamford, formed the political, military, and economic core of the Norse-controlled lands in England. Together, they were known as the 5 Boroughs. This section of our narrative shifts focus from borders and treaties to urban power. It is in these boroughs that the Danelaw was made real, not by the hands of kings, but by merchants, militia leaders, craftsmen, and farmers. These towns weren't just defensive outposts or symbols of Norse control. They were living systems, hubs of commerce, culture, law, and identity. Let's walk their muddy streets and trace their rise. What was a borough? In Anglo-Saxon and Norse usage alike, a boer or borough was more than just a town. It was a fortified place, sometimes a repurposed Roman settlement, other times built anew with walls, gates, and defined urban functions. A borough was a military stronghold, able to house and equip defenders. A market center, where traders from surrounding regions gathered. A seat of law, where disputes were resolved by assembly or local lord. A religious hub, increasingly tied to the Christian church even within Norse domains. The 5 boroughs were all of these and more. They formed the nerve center of Norse influence in England. Lincoln, the northern anchor. Of the 5, Lincoln was the largest and arguably the most strategically important. Built on the site of the old Roman city Lindum Colonia, Lincoln retained the stone walls, gridded street plan, and fortified hilltop that made it nearly impregnable. Located on the river Witham, with access to the sea via the Wash, it was a key trade port, connected to both inland England and the North Sea world. Archaeological finds suggest a thriving community of blacksmiths, textile workers, and moneyers' men who minted silver coins bearing Norse Christian iconography. Lincoln's mixed population, Anglo-Saxon and Norse, pagan and Christian, reflected the broader cultural hybridity of the Danelaw. Here, the Norse did not erase the past, they inhabited it. Derby, the defensive frontier. Derby, from Old Norse Duraby, village of deer, was a smaller borough but held a key defensive position in the west of the Danelaw, close to the Mercian frontier. Its location on the River Derwent and the Roman road network gave it military and logistical importance. Derby often served as a muster point for Norse military campaigns, including skirmishes into Mercia. Later Anglo-Saxon chronicles portray Derby as one of the last boroughs to fall during the reconquest by Wessex forces in the early 10th century. But within its walls, life followed a rhythm not of war, but of work. The people of Derby farmed, traded, worshipped, and built not as invaders, but as settlers defending what had become their home. Leicester, the crossroads. Leicester, also built on Roman foundations, stood at a major crossroads of trade and culture. It lay along Fosse Way, an ancient Roman road stretching across Britain. Its central location gave it both military value and economic reach, serving as a key link between northern and southern Danelaw regions. Norse burials found near the city show a blending of rites Christian crosses alongside Thor's hammers. The town hosted regular assemblies, likely modeled on the Norse Thing, where disputes were resolved and local governance upheld. Over time, these gatherings incorporated more Anglo-Saxon elements, proof of evolving, negotiated identity. Nottingham, forests and fortunes. Nottingham's fame would later grow through legends of outlaws and sheriffs, but in the Danelaw era, it was a key trading and defensive site. Surrounded by dense woodlands and fed by the River Trent, it controlled vital routes into the East Midlands. Its position made it one of the most heavily fortified boroughs under Norse control, and it served as a staging ground for deeper inland operations. Nottingham was also culturally significant. Its archaeological layers reveal dense urban development, with signs of workshops, weaving, metalwork, and imported goods from the continent. The blending of material culture, Norse tools, English pottery, Frankish beads tells us that this was no isolated Norse garrison. It was a cosmopolitan borough, grounded in commerce, open to influence. Stamford, the southern link. Stamford, the southernmost of the 5, was perhaps the most economically innovative. Its location near the Great North Road and the River Welland connected it to London and the southern shires. Stamford became famous for its textile production, especially wool and woven cloth. Norse settlers here adapted quickly to English agricultural rhythms, integrating into long-distance trade networks. It also produced one of the earliest mints in the Danelaw. Stamford's silver coins circulated widely, showing both the economic ambition and political assertion of Norse authority. But Stamford's significance wasn't just commercial. It became a model town, showing how Norse governance could merge with English infrastructure to create sustainable urban life. Governance in the boroughs. The 5 boroughs were semi-autonomous, each ruled by a local Norse jarl or military leader. Yet, they often acted in concert. Military coordination. When Wessex forces advanced, the boroughs sometimes pooled militias for defense. Economic policy. Coinage, market laws, and trade weights were occasionally standardized across boroughs. Legal assemblies. Each borough had its own thing-like council, where free men could speak and local matters were resolved. Though not a kingdom in name, the 5 boroughs formed a kind of urban confederation, the closest thing the Danelaw had to a unified administrative structure. A kingdom in all but name. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle refers to these towns simply as the 5 boroughs, but for a time, they functioned as a de facto kingdom within the Danelaw. They had their own laws, coins, armies, and leaders. They coordinated militarily and economically. They maintained diplomatic neutrality, or cautious peace, with Wessex after the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum. So why weren't they considered a kingdom? Perhaps because unity was never the goal. The Norse settlers in these towns prized local autonomy, and the decentralized ethos of the Danelaw meant that cooperation did not require centralization. It was a different model of power, one rooted in consensus, trade, and survival rather than royal decree. You walk through the market square in Stamford now between stalls of smoked eels, leather goods, and iron tools. A priest stands near a coin weigher. A jarl's man oversees the weighing of wool sacks. Children dart through the crowds, calling out in 2 tongues. The town is bustling, secure, alive. It is not a borderland. It is not a battlefield. It is a borough. But can a group of towns hold together without a crown? And how long can a people remain free when kings begin to turn their gaze north? There is a scent in the air: smoke, sweat, and sheep's wool. You're standing at the edge of a bustling market in Nottingham, sometime around 920 AD. The crowd is loud but not unruly. A juggler tosses knives for coins, and behind him, traders argue over the weight of silver. There are Norsemen with braided beards, Anglo-Saxon farmers with barley to sell, and even Frankish cloth merchants laying out fine weaves. Here in the boroughs of the Danelaw, commerce is power. Trade routes pulse like veins through the streets, sustaining a network of towns more connected than many kingdoms. The Norse settlers who once prized plunder now prize silver, contracts, and predictable exchange. This shift from raiders to economic stewards is nowhere more visible than in the 5 boroughs. This section explores how these towns were knit together not by force, but by function through coinage, trade, communal law, and the quiet rhythms of urban life. The story of the Danelaw is not only one of conflict, it is one of cooperation and economic integration, forged in the fire of shared need. A web of markets. Each of the 5 boroughs functioned as an economic anchor for its region. They weren't just gathering places, they were gateways, drawing in goods from across the Danelaw and beyond. Lincoln connected to York and the Humber, allowing movement of timber, hides, and metal goods. Leicester drew produce from the fertile Midlands, grain, cheese, salted meats. Nottingham gathered furs and livestock from the forest and uplands to the north and west. Stamford funneled cloth and finished textiles into southern markets, including London. Derby handled iron, salt, and river trade from inland Mercia. Trade routes followed Roman roads and river systems efficient and reliable. Barges traveled east-west across the Trent and north-south via the Fosse Way. These were not accidental connections. The Norse recognized and revived Roman infrastructure, integrating it into their expanding economy. Silver as civilization. More than grain or cloth, it was silver that defined the economic culture of the Danelaw. Norse traders introduced the hack-silver system, silver used not in coins but as cut pieces, weighed and valued by mass. It was flexible, universal, and suited to high-value exchanges. But by the early 900s, The Danelaw also minted official coins, especially in Lincoln and Stamford. These bore Christian symbols, Norse designs, and inscriptions in Latin or Old Norse script. This dual system created a fluid economy. Large-scale transactions, especially with outsiders, used weighed silver. Local markets preferred minted coins, especially as trust in standardized currency grew. Coinage was political, too. Each borough minted coins under the authority of local jarls, asserting autonomy while also acknowledging Christian legitimacy. A Stamford coin might bear a cross, but also a Thor's hammer, blending two worlds in one disc of silver. Market regulation and legal order. Markets thrived not just because of supply and demand, but because of trust, and trust required rules. Each borough had market laws regulating weights, prices, and measurements. Watchmen and reeves to prevent theft, fraud, or violence. Fixed penalties for crimes, paid in coin or silver weight. Disputes were settled in local things, community assemblies. Here, traders, craftsmen, and landholders brought grievances. A butcher shortchanged a farmer on pork. A trader claimed another sold spoiled grain. A blacksmith accused a neighbor of copying his tools. Such cases were heard before peers, often resolved with oaths, witnesses, or the payment of wergild compensation. The system was familiar, drawn from Norse legal tradition, but had adapted to urban complexity. Law wasn't centralized, it was participatory. People understood the rules because they helped make them. Urban craftsmanship and specialization. The boroughs weren't just trading goods, they were making them. Archaeological finds reveal metal workshops in Lincoln and Derby, producing tools, weapons, jewelry. Textile production in Stamford, including spindle whorls, loom weights, and dye vats. Bone and antler carving in Leicester, used for combs, pins, and game pieces. Leather tanning and shoemaking in Nottingham, suggested by pits of treated hides. Craftsmen often worked in family units, their skills passed from parent to child. Tools were made to last, spoons carved with runes, shoes stitched with reinforced seams. Everyday objects bore marks of local pride and identity. These trades weren't isolated, they were connected. A blacksmith in Lincoln might sell iron rivets to a cobbler in Stamford. A weaver in Leicester could receive dyed wool from farms near Derby. The boroughs were not self-sufficient, they were interdependent. Religious institutions as economic actors. As Christianity gained influence in the Danelaw, churches and monasteries began playing economic roles. They managed grain storage, often acting as local banks of food in lean seasons. They collected tithes in silver or goods, which were then redistributed or traded. They offered contracts, written by clerics who could read and copy legal terms. Monasteries, especially in Lincoln and Stamford, also trained scribes and hosted market fairs, combining religious festivals with commercial gatherings. Faith and commerce became linked. Baptism was free, but burial plots near the altar came at a price. Religion was not just salvation, it was structure. Women's roles in urban life. Within the boroughs, women played significant roles economically and legally. Widows ran inns or market stalls. Wives worked alongside husbands in family trades. Free women could inherit property, sue in local assemblies, and pay taxes independently. While not equal to men in all aspects, women in the Danelaw had notable autonomy, especially in cities. Some even served as coin weighers or witnesses in trade deals. Burial evidence shows women buried with tools, keys, shears, balanced scales, symbols of domestic and commercial power. Festivals, fairs, and communal identity. Life in the boroughs was not all work. Seasonal fairs and festivals brought joy and reinforced identity. Spring fairs honored planting and trade renewals. Summer markets celebrated sun and livestock sales. Winter gatherings blended Norse Yule with Christian Christmas, featuring feasting, gift-giving, and storytelling. These events were more than economic, they were social glue. Disputes were put aside. Marriages arranged. Gossip spread faster than coin. Fairs became the beating heart of borough life, drawing people from miles around. They turned cities into arenas of exchange, cultural as well as commercial. You sit now on a bench in Leicester, watching the bustle of a feast day market. The coins in your pouch bear the mark of your town. The wool you sell comes from a farm outside Derby. The ribbon your daughter wears came from York. The prayers at Mass sound familiar, but so do the chants from the Norse trader blessing his ship. You realize the Danelaw is not just a region, it's a network, a rhythm, a way of living with one another even if the past began with war. But you wonder, can cities built on trade survive the coming of kings? What happens when independence is bought and then taxed? You stand atop the walls of Derby, watching banners on the horizon. They are not Norse, these bear the dragon of Wessex. The town holds its breath. There are no screams, no sounds of battle, only the quiet clatter of hooves and a lone horn blowing in the distance. It is 917. Wessex is rising. This final section explores how the five boroughs, the economic and administrative heart of the Danelaw, fell not in flames, but in quiet surrenders, political deals, and the slow inevitability of unification. Their fall did not signal the end of Danelaw culture. Rather, it marked the beginning of their transformation into English towns, bound not by jarls, but by kings. A changing balance of power. By the early 10th century, the rulers of Wessex were no longer content with borders. After Alfred's death, his children and grandchildren expanded south into Cornwall, east into Kent, and now north into the Danelaw. Edward the Elder, r. 899–924, Alfred's son, was deliberate and methodical. His sister, Ethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians, was one of the most capable leaders of the time. She fortified towns, led campaigns, and negotiated with Norse lords on nearly equal footing. They launched a military-political campaign to reclaim the boroughs not through open war alone, but through alliances, oaths, and sieges that rarely required slaughter. The five boroughs, for all their strength, were not unified. Each was ruled by a local jarl, each with different interests and levels of loyalty to broader Norse authority. This made them vulnerable to divide-and-rule tactics. The order of submission. The year 917 was pivotal. Derby. Ethelfled took Derby after what appears to have been a brief siege. Contemporary accounts suggest local support for the Mercians. Possibly Anglo-Saxon populations welcomed the return of familiar rule. Ethelfled lost 4 of her thanes, a small cost for a major gain. Leicester submitted peacefully to Ethelfled shortly after Derby. No battle is recorded. The town likely negotiated terms of submission, retaining many local customs and leaders. Nottingham and Stamford submitted to Edward the Elder, likely through show of force and political pressure. These towns were fortified but isolated. Rather than fight a losing war, their leaders yielded. Lincoln, the most resistant and well-fortified, Lincoln held out longest. It eventually submitted in the early 920s, not through conquest, but through oaths and diplomacy, possibly involving the church and royal envoys. By 924, all 5 boroughs were under English control. The mechanics of submission. What did submission actually mean in this context? Oaths of loyalty were sworn to Edward or Ethelfled. Boroughs retained local leaders, now answerable to English kings. Taxes, known as geld, began flowing to Winchester rather than York or local jarls. Legal systems were not immediately overwritten. The Danelaw's customs continued for generations in many areas recognized as valid under royal law. This was a pragmatic unification, not a purge. Rather than erase the Norse legacy, Edward and his successors absorbed it. They knew that burning boroughs would only destroy what made them valuable. Coinage, church, and control. After submission, one of the most visible changes was in coinage. Borough mints continued operating, but began issuing coins bearing the king's name and symbol. Over time, this standardized currency helped tie the Danelaw towns into a wider English economy, reducing regional independence. Church authority also expanded. New bishops were appointed in the boroughs. Old churches were renovated, rededicated, or incorporated into the diocesan structure of Wessex. Churchmen served as agents of royal policy, educating elites, resolving disputes, and slowly encouraging conformity with Southern religious norms. Resistance and retention. Not all change was welcome. Some Norse landowners lost status or were replaced by Anglo-Saxon thanes loyal to Wessex. Local resentment simmered, especially in Lincoln and Stamford, where powerful Norse families had ruled for decades. Yet open rebellion was rare. Most people, traders, farmers, artisans, adapted. Daily life remained stable. Markets continued. Local assemblies, modified things met. Mixed families raised bilingual children. The Danelaw identity persisted not as opposition, but as regional flavor within an increasingly centralized kingdom. The next generation, Danelaw no more. By the time Athelstan, Edward's son, became king in 924, the five boroughs had ceased to be a separate political entity. Athelstan's campaigns in the north would bring York under English rule by 927, creating for the first time a kingdom of England. His law codes, issued at places like Greatley and Exeter, combined Anglo-Saxon and Norse traditions, recognizing legal pluralism. Under Athelstan and his successors, the Danelaw faded not because it failed, but because it succeeded in becoming part of something larger. Yet in many ways, the five boroughs remained distinct. They retained Old Norse place names. Their dialects evolved differently. Legal terms and customs survived in charters and court records. In Domesday Book, 1086, lands in these regions were still described with reference to Danelaw jurisdiction. Memory and myth. Though the boroughs lost autonomy, they gained legacy. Tales of the five boroughs entered folklore, romanticized as strongholds of freedom or Norse honor. Later English kings traced charters and land claims back to these towns, often invoking them as symbols of legitimacy. Even the Norman rulers, foreign conquerors themselves, respected the unique character of these towns, granting some charter liberties that others lacked. The boroughs outlived their political moment. They endured as cities, as regional centers, and as the foundation for future English urban development. You walk through Lincoln in the 930s. The city is still Norse in its rhythms: longhouses, carved beams, old stone walls. But the church bell sounds louder now. The market coin bears Athelstan's name. The reeve reports to a royal messenger, not a local jarl. Yet people still speak of the old ways. They still gather at the place where the thing once met. They still bless their ships with words half in Norse, half in English. And you wonder, can a city lose its independence, but keep its soul? Story 5. Alfred's Burh's fortifications as quiet resistance. The battle lines are no longer drawn across open fields, but in the grain of timber, the angle of ditches, and the pathways through newly laid streets. It is the year 880, and you stand within the unfinished walls of a town that did not exist 5 years ago. Around you, laborers dig trenches, raise earth, and lay stone under the eye of a royal agent bearing the seal of King Alfred of Wessex. There is no immediate enemy outside the gate, but everyone knows it. The Danes will come again. And when they do, they will find a different England. In this story, we follow the vision of King Alfred the Great, not as a warlord or theologian, but as a builder, a man who believed that the survival of his kingdom required more than warriors. It required walls, planning, and a network of communities that could resist not just attack but disorder. This section explores the creation of the burh system, a grid of fortified towns designed to repel Norse incursions, rebuild stability, and lay the groundwork for a new English identity. Why build burhs? After the trauma of the Viking invasions of the 860s and 870s, Wessex stood as the last surviving Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Alfred's military successes, most famously at Edington, had preserved the realm, but victory in battle was not enough. The Danes had not been defeated, merely redirected. The Danelaw had been created, and peace was always tentative. Alfred recognized a central truth: Wessex could not survive through reaction alone. It needed defensive infrastructure, administrative cohesion, a symbolic statement of permanence. And so he built the burh's fortified settlement that functioned as both military and civic centers. What is a burh? The term burh, plural burhs or byrrig, comes from Old English, meaning fortified place. The concept was not new. Many burhs were built on old Roman sites or Iron Age hill forts, but Alfred's use of them was systematic and coordinated, and unlike anything previously seen in Anglo-Saxon England. A burh was a walled enclosure with ditches, ramparts, and palisades, designed to house a garrison and local civilians, a place where markets were held and laws enforced, built to support a standing defense force capable of resisting fast-moving Norse raiders. Alfred did not just build one or two. He launched a program of construction that would eventually create over 30 burhs across Wessex and Mercia. The Burgel Hittage, a blueprint for defense. The clearest record of Alfred's project is the Burgel Hittage, a document likely compiled around 919 during his son Edward's reign, but based on Alfred's plans. It lists 33 burhs, each with defensive perimeters measured in feet, the number of hides, units of land, responsible for supporting its garrison, their strategic roles, often positioned near rivers, roads, or vulnerable borders. Some notable examples: Winchester, the royal capital, a massive 4,560-foot perimeter. Wallingford, built near the Thames to control river crossings. Wareham, repaired Roman walls and added a strategic coastal defense. The system ensured that no person in Wessex was more than a day's march from a burh, making it nearly impossible for raiders to operate unopposed. Life inside the burhs. A burh was not merely a fortress, it was a town in formation. Military function. Each hide of land was responsible for supplying one man for burh defense. Garrisons could be called upon quickly when Norse raiders approached. Burhs housed armories, watch posts, and militia mustering points. Economic function. Markets were established, often regulated by the king's reeve. Trade was centralized and taxed. Craftsmen, merchants, and farmers settled inside the walls, creating a protected economy. Legal and administrative function. Burhs became centers of royal justice and local governance. Royal charters often mention burhs as the places where writs were issued and disputes settled. Alfred issued laws requiring all trade to occur within a burh to be considered official and lawful. Rebuilding the Roman past. Alfred understood the symbolic power of ruins. In towns like Winchester, Exeter, and Bath, he deliberately rebuilt over Roman foundations. This was a message. English kings were not just survivors, they were heirs to a greater legacy. By reviving Roman street grids, using stone architecture, and reclaiming old civic centers, Alfred claimed continuity, not chaos. Some burhs were built from scratch, others reimagined old settlements. All were connected by a common idea, that order could resist entropy and walls could hold more than men, they could hold hope. Logistics and labor. Constructing burhs required immense coordination. Timber had to be felled, shaped, and transported. Stone had to be quarried or scavenged. Labor came from local levies, compelled by royal decree. Roads were improved to move supplies, creating a pro-infrastructure network across Wessex. But Alfred was not building for vanity. His laws protected laborers, markets were fair, and many burhs quickly became attractive places to live, offering safety, opportunity, and a role in a grander vision. Women, children, and civic life. While the burhs were designed as defensive structures, they became social microcosms. Families relocated inside wall during times of unrest. Churches were founded or rebuilt, fostering religious community. Schools were created, part of Alfred's broader push for education and literacy. Burhs offered refuge, not just resistance. For many, the walls symbolized more than war, they were a place to begin again. Norse response and adaptation. The Danes were not blind to Alfred's project. As burhs sprang up along key rivers and trade routes, their raiding became riskier and less profitable. Some Norse leaders adapted, turning to settlement and farming instead of seasonal raiding, attempting to build or occupy their own fortified positions, as seen in York and the Five Boroughs. But Alfred's system worked, raiding declined, urban life recovered, trade stabilized. The very act of planning defense created peace. From forts to foundations. By the end of Alfred's reign in 899, the burhs were more than a defensive system, they were the seeds of modern English towns. Many would evolve into cathedral cities, market hubs, and regional capitals. They gave rise to borough charters, legal identities, and local pride. The word burh would become borough, and eventually, burghers, the townspeople who formed the basis of a rising middle class. You stand now in Winchester, no longer a king's dream but a living town. Its streets are clean, its walls stand strong. The market is busy, and the bell from the church tolls the hour. You remember when this place was just trenches and scaffolding. Now it is something else, a promise fulfilled. But you ask, can walls built for defense become the walls of a nation? And what happens when peace removes the need for stone? The wooden gate groans as it swings shut, and you hear the muffled clank of the iron bar dropping into place. Outside, a few late-arriving farmers shout, hopping to be let in before dusk. Inside the walls of Wallingford, the sounds of saws, hammers, and curses echo down the alleys. The walls are nearly finished, but the town is tired, its people burdened by years of construction, levies, and royal mandates. The burhs of Alfred's England were not simply symbols of safety. They were economic and social burdens for those who built, maintained, and lived within them. While we remember Alfred as a builder of peace and a planner of cities, the reality is more complicated. This section explores the costs of fortification, the strains placed on labor, the tension between rural and urban interests, and the shifting balance of local autonomy and royal control. The burhs were a revolution, but revolutions are rarely painless. The hidden labor behind the walls. Every ditch dug, every timber hewn, and every stone laid had a cost, not in silver, but in time, muscle, and blood. Under Alfred's system, every 5 hides of land owed 1 man to garrison the burh. Local peasants and farmers were expected to provide labor for maintenance, repairs, and construction. Noblemen were required to sponsor building efforts, often at great expense. Many were willing at first. After all, the memory of Norse raids was fresh. But as time passed, some began to question the endless effort. Crops went unharvested while able-bodied men built ditches. Trade slowed when merchants were diverted to construction. Smallholders struggled to fulfill obligations without falling into debt. Records from later in Edward's reign show disputes over bar labor becoming increasingly common. Some villages petitioned for relief from duties they could no longer afford. Peace had its price, and not everyone was able to pay. Rural resentment and redistribution. The bar system fundamentally changed the relationship between town and countryside. Markets were increasingly held only within bars, meaning that rural producers had to transport goods into town, often paying market fees. The crown issued edicts requiring trade to be overseen by reeves, reducing local bargaining power and enforcing standardized weights and measures. While this increased economic consistency and tax revenue, it also fostered resentment among rural populations, who felt excluded from the privileges of the towns. There are recorded instances where market roads were blocked by villagers protesting tolls. Trade was smuggled outside official channels. Rural thanes ignored summons to provide garrison troops, forcing urban dwellers to compensate. Alfred's vision created a centralized economy, but also sowed the seeds of tension between center and periphery. Social stratification within the bars. Within the towns themselves, not all residents shared equally in the new prosperity. Land within the walls became increasingly valuable. Some wealthier families bought up parcels, building stone houses while others lived in wooden huts. Merchants and craftsmen flourished, protected by the crown's laws, but laborers and smallholders often found themselves priced out. Religious institutions, particularly churches and monasteries, were granted prime land and tax exemptions, which drew ire from less privileged residents. This growing stratification echoed what would later develop in medieval towns: class division within urban centers, driven by access to property, trade, and influence. It is worth noting that Alfred likely foresaw some of this, but saw it as a necessary sacrifice. The alternative was chaos, and chaos, he believed, was far worse than inequality. The role of the reeve. To manage the complexity of bar life, Alfred expanded the role of the reeve, a royal agent who combined duties of mayor, sheriff, and judge. Reeves oversaw markets, ensuring that laws were followed and taxes collected. They enforced the king's peace, resolving disputes and punishing theft or fraud. They were responsible for organizing the garrison, inspecting defenses, and reporting to royal authorities. While reeves brought order and efficiency, they were also viewed as instruments of the crown, sometimes corrupt or heavy-handed. Some reeves imposed extra tolls for market stalls, took bribes to overlook minor offenses, sided with wealthy merchants in disputes. This tension created a layer of bureaucracy that, while stabilizing, also introduced new forms of power imbalance. The bar was no longer just a place of defense, it became a place where power was administered. The loss of local identity. Another, subtler cost of Alfred's bars was cultural erosion. Before the bar system, communities were organized around kinship and local assemblies. Trade and law were customary, not centralized. Identity was tied to the land, and the clan, not to a monarch's plan. As bars grew, local traditions were overridden by standard laws. Royal authority replaced tribal consensus. The idea of a kingdom-wide identity began to take hold. This transition was not immediate, but it was real. A shepherd from Dorset or a smith from Wiltshire might once have thought of themselves as West Saxon, or simply of the village. Now they were increasingly taught that they were English. Some adapted, others resisted. Women's lives in fortified towns. Within the walls, life for women was also transformed, sometimes for the better. The security of the bars allowed women to operate stalls, own property, and petition royal courts. Widows were able to hold leases on homes or workshops. Alfred's laws offered legal protections for women inside burghs that were not always available in the countryside. However, new risks emerged. Overcrowding in some towns led to poorer living conditions. Exploitation by landlords or employers became more common. And the visibility of women in markets drew moral scrutiny from church officials, who increasingly sought to regulate behavior. Thus, while the burghs expanded opportunity, they also created new forms of control. The long game. Despite these burdens, Alfred's burghs worked. Attacks decreased, trade revived. Law became something one could rely on, not perfectly, but more so than before. But Alfred did not live to see the full result of his project. He died in 899. His son Edward the Elder and daughter Ethelfled would continue and expand the burgh system across Mercia and into the fringes of the Danelaw. As the decades passed, the burghs that once burdened became centers of wealth, cathedrals, and royal cities. But in these early years, they were a gamble. You stand now in Wareham, once a place of sacked churches and Norse camps, now guarded by a clean rampart and a stone gate. Inside, children chase chickens through the streets. A woman sells loaves beside a reeve inspecting weights and measures. A carpenter mends the wall with care, watched by an old man who remembers when the Danes took this town. And you wonder, if peace is built on burdens, how many burdens can a people bear before they forget why they began? The walls no longer creak, they've been rebuilt in stone. It is the mid-10th century. Winchester is bustling, its Roman grid alive with merchants, its churches humming with Latin chants. There are no raiders now. Instead, messengers from across the realm bring news to the royal court. In the burghs once built to resist destruction, a kingdom is being built. In this final section, we examine the long-term impact of Alfred's burghs not just as fortresses, but as the foundation of English statehood. These once improvised defenses evolved into permanent towns, centers of government and anchors of English identity. From simple timber walls came something far greater, the idea of England itself. Burghs become boroughs. By the time of Athelstan, Alfred's grandson, many burghs had transformed. Timber palisades were replaced with stone walls. Temporary military camps grew into permanent urban centers. Former royal agents became hereditary reeves, mayors, and civic leaders. These evolving settlements took on new names and roles over time. Burgh right arrow borough. Byrigh, the plural right arrow roots of modern place names like Canterbury, Salisbury, and Banbury. Many towns added Bury, borough, or burgh to their names, reflecting their origin as fortified burghs. These were no longer just emergency defenses. They had become towns with charters, trade privileges, and representatives at court, and crucially, they were recognizably English. The growth of town life. By the 11th century, many of Alfred's original burghs had developed. Regular markets, sometimes granted by royal charter. Guilds of merchants and craftsmen, organizing trade and standards. Stone churches and monasteries, anchoring both spirituality and education. Local courts, managing property, contracts, and disputes. This created a new urban culture still small by modern standards, but a major shift in Anglo-Saxon society. England was becoming a land not only of fields and villages, but of towns, each with a distinct identity and civic pride. The idea of the freeman of the borough would echo through English legal tradition for centuries. The birth of administrative England. The burgh system also influenced how England was governed. Because the burghs were linked to land assessments, hides, taxation, and levies became more standardized. The network of towns allowed royal officials to collect revenue, enforce laws, and issue writs. Over time, burghs served as administrative nodes, with reeves and bishops working together to implement royal policy. Under King Edgar R. 959–975, this system was so well organized that England was divided into shires, each with its own sheriff, shire reeve, answerable to the king. The roots of modern English bureaucracy, in all its drudging precision, can be traced back to these boring towns of Alfred's vision. Burghs in the Norman conquest. Even after the Norman invasion of 1066, the legacy of the burghs persisted. William the Conqueror recognized their value and often built castles adjacent to or within burgh walls, as in Oxford, Exeter, and Wallingford. The Domesday Book, 1086, documents many former burghs, noting their size, population, and tax obligations. Some burghs were granted borough status, with rights to elect officials and hold courts. In many ways, the Normans inherited Alfred's framework. His burghs had become too useful to ignore, even for foreign kings. Cultural and legal legacy. Alfred's burghs did not merely shape infrastructure, they shaped English law, identity, and memory. The requirement to trade in burghs created a sense of regulated commerce that evolved into English common law. The distinction between town dwellers and rural villagers fed into later legal and political categories. Over centuries, the borough charter would become a prized possession, marking independence from feudal lords and a direct relationship with the king. By the high medieval period, these old burghs had birthed the English civic tradition, a notion that law could come from the town square, not just the battlefield. Echoes in modern England. Even today, Alfred's burghs leave their mark. Towns like Winchester, Wallingford, Wareham, and Chester trace their civic identity directly to Alfred's foundations. Some streets still follow Roman or Burgh-era layouts. Place names like Shaftesbury or Salisbury recall their defensive origins. Local councils, borough elections, and civic charters all evolved from systems first tested within those walls. Though most of the timber walls are gone, their influence remains woven into the legal and physical map of Britain. The irony of stability. Alfred's system worked so well that it outlived its military purpose. By the 11th century, Viking raids had faded. Burghs, once built to defend, now found themselves centers of commerce, dispute, and daily life. Their martial roots were slowly forgotten, replaced by memories of guild feasts and harvest markets. The irony is that the towns built for war became places where ordinary life flourished, where wives sold ale, children learned letters, and the smell of fresh bread replaced that of wet timber and sweat. In Alfred's hands, fortifications were not about isolation, but about connection, walls that enclosed, yes, but also welcomed. You walk now along the edge of Wareham, where the old rampart still rises like a grassy hill. Children roll down its side. A cyclist passes by. A low plaque tells of a king who once ordered its construction not for glory, but for safety. There are no enemies on the horizon, just seagulls and the smell of the harbor. And you wonder, when a wall is no longer needed, does it still stand, not for protection but as memory? Story 6. The Danelaw's Law, Custom, Courts, and the Quiet Power of Assembly. The meeting place is not grand. It's just a low hill, flattened by centuries of trampling feet. The sky hangs overcast. There's a smell of peat and sheep, but the people gathered here take it seriously. There are no thrones, no crowns, just a circle of men, and the law spoken aloud. This is the thing, the Norse assembly, and for the people of the Danelaw, it was as important as any fortress. Long before parliaments and professional judges, law was community. And in the Danelaw, where Norse and Anglo-Saxon customs met and mingled, justice was a living thing, not written in parchment but recited, argued, and remembered. In this section, we begin our exploration of how the Danelaw was governed not by decree, but by custom, consensus, and obligation. What was the Danelaw? Before diving into its legal life, we must recall what the Danelaw actually was. The Danelaw was not a single state, nor a formal kingdom. It was a region of England, roughly from the River Thames northward to the Humber and eastward to the coast, that came under Norse control following the Viking incursions of the 9th century. Established after the Treaty of Wedmore, 878, it was recognized in part by King Alfred and later expanded under Norse rulers, including Guthrum and the Jarls of York. Unlike Wessex, which increasingly centralized power under a king, the Danelaw preserved a decentralized structure with local assemblies, oral law, and communal decision-making. This made it a different kind of polity, one where law was performed, not simply enforced. The Thing assembly as authority. At the heart of Danelaw governance was the Thing, Old Norse. Thing, a public assembly where free men came together to hear and recite laws, resolve disputes, levy fines or declare compensation, elect local leaders or approve major decisions. Things were not courts in the modern sense, but rather forums of negotiated justice. The authority of the law came not from a king's decree, but from tradition and agreement among the people. In the Danelaw, each district had its own thing, usually meeting at a traditional site, often a hill, a tree, or a crossroads. The law speaker, Lurgsargumether, recited the laws from memory. Disputes were settled by local consensus or by panels of assessors, akin to early juries. Unlike in Wessex, where law was increasingly written and centralized, the Danelaw kept alive older Germanic traditions, valuing oral memory, local autonomy, and fairness over formality. Legal customs in the Danelaw. Though we lack a Danelaw legal code as neat as those of Alfred or Uneasy, enough survives through later English charters, court records, and Norman documentation to tell us about its distinct features. Some key characteristics of Danelaw justice. Wergild man price. A deeply rooted Germanic concept, the wergild assigned a monetary value to every person based on their status. If a person was killed or injured, the responsible party owed compensation, not vengeance. Wergild was systematized in the Danelaw, with values varying by age, sex, and rank. Oath-taking. Legal disputes often involved oath helpers, people who swore that a claim was true or that a person's character was sound. A man's reputation could be his strongest legal shield. Kinship law. Families were legally responsible for the actions of their members. If someone committed a crime, their kin could be summoned to pay the fine or offer guarantees of future good behavior. Trial by ordeal or duel was rare in the Danelaw. Instead, arbitration and compromise were valued. The goal was to restore balance, not exact punishment. The role of women in legal life. Interestingly, the Danelaw offered women slightly greater legal visibility than some other Anglo-Saxon regions. Women could inherit property, especially in Norse custom. Widows had the right to represent themselves in disputes over land or inheritance. In some cases, women could speak at assembly, particularly in matters of family honor or dowry disputes. This is not to say the society was egalitarian, it was not. But compared to the rigid male-dominated laws of later Norman England, the Danelaw's customs offered more flexibility, particularly for women of property or social standing. Law as memory. One of the most fascinating and easily overlooked aspects of Danelaw justice was its oral nature. Laws were memorized, not written. The law speaker, sometimes elected for life, was required to recite a portion of the law at every meeting, ensuring it remained current and known to the public. Memory was not just individual, but communal. Disputes were judged not only on what happened, but on what the community remembered about those involved. This system demanded constant participation and deep-rooted social memory. Elders played a key role in shaping decisions, not by command, but by recollection. Quiet power, why it worked. At first glance, such a decentralized and informal system might seem weak, but in practice, it worked surprisingly well for centuries. Why? Scale, communities were small enough that most people knew one another, or knew of one another. Honor culture. Reputation was vital. Being known as dishonest or violent could mean economic and social isolation. Flexible enforcement. Law in the Danelaw was not about rigid rules, but about negotiated balance. This allowed for pragmatic solutions, especially when central authority was distant or non-existent. In a region still recovering from conquest and colonization, such a system provided stability without autocracy. Friction at the borders. However, the Danelaw's legal customs didn't exist in a vacuum. To the south and west, Wessex and Mercia operated under increasingly codified royal law, backed by sheriffs, writs, and formal courts. As the English kings reasserted control over Danelaw territory in the 10th and 11th centuries, conflicts began to emerge. Which law applied when a West Saxon merchant was robbed in Lincoln? Could a Norse settler use oath helpers if the local reeve demanded written charters? Did the king's peace override the decisions of a local thing? These tensions would eventually lead to hybrid legal systems, especially under King Edgar and later under Danish kings like Cnut, who sought to blend English and Danish customs into a functional whole. The thing as community. Ultimately, the thing was more than just a legal institution. It was a place where community was reinforced. Power was exercised through consent, not just coercion. The boundaries of justice were spoken, not imposed. You might be summoned for a land dispute, but stay to hear the new bylaws on fencing or discuss a marriage contract between families. Law, after all, was not separate from life. You sit now beneath a weathered oak on the edge of a low hill. Men of all ages gather, some with spears, most without. An old man steps forward and begins to speak not in Latin, but in a language shaped by sea and soil. He is not reading, he is remembering. And you wonder, what happens to a people when their laws are no longer spoken aloud? When memory gives way to paper, does justice forget how to listen? The market is crowded. Lincoln's stalls overflow with furs, iron tools, and salted fish. Traders speak in a mix of Norse, Old English, and the rough dialects of the Danelaw. Nearby, a reeve posts a new notice. It's a royal writ, sealed in wax and written in careful script. Few in the square can read it, but they know what it means. The king's law has arrived. This section explores what happened when the customary, consensus-based legal life of the Danelaw began to intersect with the written, centralized royal justice of Wessex. It was not a clash, but a long negotiation. A quiet blending of two traditions, one oral, local, and communal, the other written, hierarchical, and authoritative. In that tension, we find the roots of English law as we know it today. The return of royal authority. After Alfred's defensive success and his death in 899, his successors began a gradual reconquest of the Danelaw. Edward the Elder and Ethelfled brought towns like Derby, Leicester, and Stamford under English control in the 910s. Athelstan, in 927, captured York and became the first king to rule all of England in name. But conquest raised a problem: how to govern these culturally and legally distinct regions. The Danelaw didn't operate under charters or writs. It had no tradition of direct royal enforcement. Many communities still settled disputes by oath, kinship, or negotiated wergild, not royal punishment. So the kings adapted. Rather than impose Wessex law overnight, they pursued a policy of gradual integration, recognizing local custom while asserting royal supremacy. Legal pluralism, the threefold law. King Edgar the Peaceful R. 959-975, formalized this reality in a remarkable decree. He recognized three legal regions within England: Wessex law, Mercian law, Danelaw. Each region had its own customs, fines, and procedures, but all were under the king's peace. This approach is known as legal pluralism, the coexistence of multiple legal systems under a single sovereign. It was rare for the time and speaks to the pragmatism of English rulers. They understood that the law's legitimacy rested not just in power, but in tradition. As a result, Danelaw wergilds remained higher than those in Wessex for some time. Thing-style assemblies were preserved in many areas, especially in Lincolnshire and Yorkshire. Local customs like land measurement in carucates, not hides, were maintained. The result was not legal chaos, but a mosaic of norms that functioned surprisingly well. The rise of the hundred court. To bridge the gap between local custom and royal justice, the English crown expanded the use of hundred courts. A hundred was a subdivision of a shire, theoretically comprising 100 households. These courts met regularly and included reeves, landowners, and local elders. They blended elements of the thing communal judgment and oath-taking with royal oversight, including the use of written charters and appointed officials. In the Danelaw, these courts became points of negotiation. Royal writs might be read aloud, but local jurors still decided many outcomes. Law speakers might recite traditional rights, but sheriffs ensured fines were collected. This created a hybrid model, both Norse and English, oral and written, communal and royal. The writ and the word. The growing presence of written law transformed legal culture. Kings issued writs, commands under seal, declaring ownership, resolving disputes, or granting privileges. These writs were read aloud in public, often at the site of the old thing. While few could read them, the seal and the king's name carried authority. This created a tension between memory and paper. Could a writ overturn a remembered oath? Could a charter displace a custom known to all men? If a reeve produced a sealed order, did it carry more weight than a communal decision? Over time, written law began to dominate, but not completely. In the Danelaw, especially in rural areas, oral tradition persisted into the 12th century. Law under Cnut, a Danish-English fusion. In 1016, a new king came to power, Cnut the Great, a Danish warrior who became king of all England. Cnut's reign, 1016-1035, is especially notable for legal policy. Rather than impose Danish law, Cnut issued codes that reinforced English customs, including many Danelaw practices. He maintained regional legal distinctions, confirming that Danelaw norms would continue. Cnut's laws emphasized justice, equity, and compensation, hallmarks of both Norse and Anglo-Saxon legal thought. His goal was not to erase identity, but to stabilize his realm, and in that he succeeded. Under Cnut, the Danelaw was no longer a frontier. It was part of a consolidated, multicultural kingdom where law was a tool of peace, not control. The slow fade of custom. By the time of the Norman conquest, 1066, much of the Danelaw's legal distinctiveness had faded into practice. Many thing assemblies had become hundred courts. Law speakers were replaced by royal judges and clerks. Written charters and property rolls replaced spoken oaths and memory. But echoes remained. Place names like Wapentake, Norse for hundred, continued in use. Some manorial customs preserved elements of Danelaw land law. In parts of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, oral legal traditions were still cited in disputes centuries later. The Danelaw, as a legal entity, faded, but its customs helped shape a flexible, localist tradition in English law that endures even now. The legacy of blended justice. the integration of Danelaw law into the English legal fabric had profound effects. It created a legal culture of accommodation, not domination. It preserved local autonomy in the face of expanding royal power. It encouraged legal literacy among ordinary people who participated in courts, gave oaths, and remembered law. In many ways, it laid the groundwork for the common law tradition, a system based not just on statutes, but on precedent, memory, and practice. And all of it began in muddy fields, beneath gray skies, with laws spoken aloud to neighbors. You stand in a quiet churchyard in Yorkshire. Nearby, a stone cross marks where the old thing once met. A modern town has grown over the hill, but the site remains untouched, out of habit or reverence. You imagine the voices that once rose there, arguing land boundaries, swearing oaths, remembering the price of a cow or the shame of theft. And you wonder, when law is blended, not broken, does a people forget its past or carry it unspoken into the future? The court is in session, but the king is not present. Instead, a dozen men, landowners, merchants, and clergy sit in judgment. The sheriff reads a claim, the jurors murmur and confer. The man on trial swears an oath. A decision is made. It is recorded, and it will be remembered. It is the year 1208, and though this is a royal court under King John, the forms and rhythms echo something older. The thing, the wergild, the communal memory of the Danelaw. In this final section, we examine how the quiet, local, customary justice of the Danelaw became part of the English common law, a legal tradition that would one day span the globe. From modest beginnings in Danish settlements, this unassuming legacy would influence everything from jury trials to property rights and parliamentary government. Let us follow the path from the spoken law of freemen to the written laws of empires. The decline of the Danelaw, but not its law. By the mid-11th century, the Danelaw had lost its identity as a separate region. Several events sealed its fate. The death of King Cnut in 1035 led to internal Danish divisions and weakened ties to Scandinavia. The ascension of Edward, the Confessor, brought renewed emphasis on Anglo-Saxon court structures. The Norman conquest in 1066 imposed a powerful, centralized regime that gradually erased the distinctions between English regions. And yet, the Normans did not completely obliterate local law. They were keen recorders and administrators, and they found a rich tradition of local legal practice already functioning in England. In parts of Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and East Anglia, former Danelaw strongholds, the Normans found thing-style assemblies still active. They adapted these into manorial courts and shire courts, but often retained local customs. The Domesday Book, 1086, carefully recorded wergild rates, land units like carucates, and customary obligations, preserving them as the backbone of feudal administration. In this way, the Danelaw's oral and communal practices were preserved through record-keeping, often by the very conquerors who ended its autonomy. The rise of customary law. As England centralized, law became more formal and consistent. Royal courts expanded under Henry II in the 12th century. Judges traveled the kingdom, applying a common law that would override local inconsistencies. Written records, plea rolls, writs, charters, became normative sources of legal authority. But here, the key. This common law was built not from scratch, but from local practices and long memory. The jury of presentment, where local men judged local disputes, echoed the thing. Wergild evolved into damages, but the principle of monetary compensation remained. Local knowledge was still crucial to judgments. Early jurors were not passive listeners, they were witnesses of custom and behavior. Common law was, in essence, custom law made royal. And many of those customs had deep roots in the Danelaw. The jury, from thingmen to jurymen. Perhaps the most enduring legacy is the jury system. In Norse assemblies, disputes were resolved by panels of assessors, often respected men of the district, who knew the people and the land. Their role was not just to decide guilt or innocence, but to determine what was fair. Oaths, reputation, and consensus mattered more than strict evidence. This model survives in the English jury trial. Local jurors still hear local cases. Juries still reflect community standards. Decisions are made not by a magistrate alone, but by a body of peers. The move from thing to jury was not a rupture, it was an evolution. Land and law, the legacy of customary tenure. Another quiet inheritance of the Danelaw is found in landholding customs. The Danelaw often operated under sokemen tenure, a freer, more autonomous form of landholding than feudal villanage. Sokemen had the right to pass on land, to sue and be sued, and to appear in court without feudal permission. After the Norman conquest, sokemen continued to appear in records, especially in Danelaw regions. The Domesday Book notes high concentrations of sokemen in places like Lincolnshire and Nottinghamshire. Their rights became the foundation of English freehold tenure. Thus, long before Locke or Blackstone, the idea that a man could own land independently of a lord was already rooted in the customs of the Danelaw. Law, parliament, and local voice. The communal traditions of the Danelaw also fed into England's evolving parliamentary tradition. In the Thing, free men assembled, listened, and gave assent. Law was publicly spoken, not hidden. Leadership was subject to collective approval, at least in principle. When English kings began summoning parliaments, especially after Magna Carta 1215, they drew on similar ideas. Consent to taxation, public airing of grievances, representation by locality. Even if indirect, the memory of communal judgment and open assembly helped shape a political culture in which power must be checked by collective voice. The silent transmission of justice. It's important to note that these transformations didn't happen through manifestos or reforms. No king ever declared, "We shall now preserve the law of the Danelaw." Instead, it happened quietly through customs cited in court, disputes remembered across generations, elders teaching their sons how law worked in practice, charters copying older phrasing, jurors invoking precedents known only to the village. The Danelaw became invisible, but not forgotten. It lived on not as a separate law, but as part of the ordinary assumptions of English legal life. The empire carries the Thing. Centuries later, when British colonists carried the common law to North America, India, Australia, and Africa, they brought with them juries of peers, presumption of innocence, rules of evidence drawn from tradition, the idea that law is rooted in custom, not just decree. Few knew that some of these ideas had passed through Norse fields, Viking settlements, and Danelaw assemblies. But the DNA of those early laws traveled far, a quiet lineage in the bloodstream of empire. Memory becomes institution. In the modern age, we often think of law as a system of codes, run by experts in wigs and robes. But for over 1,000 years, English law was a collective memory, one that survived conquest, reform, and royal power. The Danelaw reminds us that law begins with community, not bureaucracy. Justice emerges from practice, not just theory. A society's values are preserved not only in parchment, but in speech, ritual, and habit. And that even the boring parts of history, the court records, the compensation schedules, the gathering on muddy hills, are where real power lives. You walk today through a courthouse. The walls are smooth, the language is technical, the judge quotes precedent. But beneath it all runs something older, the echo of voices on a hill, the murmur of free men speaking justice aloud. And you wonder, when law becomes distant, abstract, and silent, what do we lose that was once kept alive? In the voices of the folk,